There's a particular kind of silence that follows a brand's death, and then there's whatever this is. Because General Motors doesn't usually resurrect names it spent years deciding to bury. Pontiac died in 2010, not with dignity, but with a memo, a cost-cutting decision buried inside a bankruptcy restructuring, the kind of corporate footnote that ended a brand responsible for some of the most emotionally charged cars America ever built. Bonneville specifically carried decades of that identity, full-size, driver-focused, a nameplate that meant something to people who grew up watching it on American highways long before anyone talked about brand equity or nostalgia marketing. So when insiders at GM confirmed that Bonneville would return in 2027, not as a footnote or a badge slapped on a rental fleet sedan, but as a genuine flagship performance coupe, the reaction inside the automotive press was closer to disbelief than excitement. This is exactly the kind of moment the reverend culture exists to sit with, the ones where a company essentially admits it made a mistake and tries to earn back something it once threw away. There's a specific engineering choice buried in how this car's suspension and chassis were developed, something that borrows directly from a completely different segment of performance vehicle, and it explains more about what GM is actually trying to prove here than any horsepower figure will. Stand in front of it, and the first thing that registers isn't the badge, it's the confidence. This particular example wears a deep gold finish, paired with gloss black panels split along an aggressive diagonal line, a color combination GM's design team apparently chose specifically to separate Bonneville visually from every muscle car currently fighting for attention in this segment. The proportions are low and wide, with a long hood that tapers into a fastback roofline, and a front fascia dominated by a sharp, angular grille opening flanked by narrow LED lighting signatures that pull outward toward the fenders like they're being stretched by speed itself. The Pontiac Arrowhead emblem, red and chrome, sits centered above the grille, small but unmistakable, a quiet confirmation that this brand is serious about coming back, rather than trading on a logo people vaguely remember. Walk the flanks, and a sharp character line runs from the front fender through a functional side intake positioned just ahead of the rear wheel, feeding the engine bay with real, deliberate purpose. The rear is where the design fully commits. Vertical taillight elements finished in a thin red glow, a full-width diffuser in exposed carbon weave, and the Pontiac name spelled out in individual letters across a blacked-out rear panel, understated compared to the paint, but unmistakably confident. Pull the door open, and it swings with a weighted, deliberate resistance that tells your hand this isn't a lightweight econobox wearing a performance badge. Settle into the seat, and it holds you immediately. Deep bolstering, wrapped in quilted leather with contrast gold stitching that echoes the exterior without overwhelming the cabin. The scent inside is rich leather layered with something faintly metallic, carbon fiber and fresh trim settling into a new car's particular kind of quiet. The steering wheel carries real weight in your hands, leather wrapped with metallic accents that catch light rather than reflect it harshly, the Pontiac Arrowhead centered at the hub. Ahead of you, a digital gauge cluster and center display integrate cleanly into the dashboard architecture, the graphics restrained and legible rather than overstyled, clearly built by people who understood that a driver glancing down mid-corner needs clarity, not spectacle. Carbon trim threads through the lower dash and center console, and the ambient lighting stays warm and low rather than cycling through unnecessary color options. Close the door and the outside world genuinely quiets, the kind of acoustic isolation that suggests real engineering investment went into this cabin, not just the parts you can see. Now, the engineering decision worth the wait. Rather than relying purely on a stiffer, heavier chassis to control body movement the way most modern muscle coupes do, GM's engineering team reportedly borrowed adaptive damping and torque vectoring technology developed originally for their track-focused Corvette program, adapting it specifically for a front-engine, rear-wheel drive platform carrying real mass. That's an unusual crossover, mixing a mid-engine sports car's electronic chassis philosophy with a traditional muscle coupe layout, and reports suggest there was genuine internal disagreement about whether that complexity and cost belonged in a car meant to carry Pontiac's more accessible, driver-first reputation. The decision stuck anyway, because the engineers apparently believed Bonneville needed to feel meaningfully different from everything else wearing a big American V8, not just louder. Beneath that long hood sits a supercharged 6.2-liter V8, internally targeted at approximately 780 horsepower and 720 pound-feet of torque, paired with a 10-speed automatic transmission featuring genuine paddle shift control. Press the start button, and the engine catches with an immediate, heavy crack before dropping into an idle that sits low and dense, more felt through the seat than heard through the doors. Roll into the throttle gently, and the supercharger whine layers in first, a mechanical whisper riding just above the V8's low growl. Commit fully, and the sound transforms, the exhaust opening into a deep, controlled roar that builds rather than explodes, each upshift landing with a firm mechanical thud you feel through the chassis before the next surge arrives. Lift off, and there's a restrained crackle from the exhaust, present but never showing off. At sustained highway speed, that adaptive chassis system quits everything down. Road texture communicated through the seat and wheel with real clarity, while wind and mechanical noise both stay impressively controlled for a car built around this much power. The first time you actually push the Bonneville into a corner, that borrowed suspension architecture makes itself known immediately. Turn-in is sharper and more immediate than a car this size has any right to deliver. The torque vectoring quietly redistributing power between the rear wheels as you commit to the apex. The chassis rotating with a confidence that feels closer to a dedicated sports car than a traditional muscle coupe. Braking comes from 6-piston front calipers on genuinely large rotors, the pedal firm and progressive rather than grabby. The one honest compromise here is ride quality in its most aggressive suspension setting, which stays firm enough on rough pavement that daily comfort takes a noticeable back seat to outright body control, a trade-off GM's engineers have reportedly accepted rather than tried to disguise. Estimated pricing for the 2027 Bonneville sits between $78,000 and $92,000 depending on specification. Genuinely competitive territory, considering what's actually happening underneath it. The honest question is whether a revived Pontiac nameplate justifies that price against established rivals with decades of continuous brand trust behind them. And the answer isn't really about the spec sheet, it's about what buying one actually means. You're not just purchasing horsepower, you're funding proof that Pontiac deserves a second chance. And, for a certain kind of enthusiast, that emotional stake matters as much as the driving experience itself. The Bonneville doesn't sit cleanly next to a Dodge Charger or a Ford Mustang GT, because it isn't simply chasing muscle car bragging rights, it's positioning itself as a legacy revival, with genuinely disruptive chassis engineering underneath familiar bodywork, something this segment hasn't seen executed with this level of seriousness in years. The person this car was built for remembers what Pontiac actually meant before 2010, or has heard enough about it from someone who does, and wants proof that a brand can earn back trust rather than simply borrow nostalgia. They care less about outright straight-line numbers and more about a car that rewards genuine driving skill in a corner, something that feels engineered rather than simply loud. Before we close, here's a question worth genuinely debating. GM killed Pontiac in 2010 and is now spending real engineering resources to bring it back as a serious performance flagship. Does reviving a discontinued brand this way honor what people actually loved about it, or does it risk feeling like a calculated nostalgia play dressed up in real horsepower? Both sides of that argument deserve real consideration, so leave yours in the comments. And if conversations like this one are why you're here, stay with the Reverend culture, because there's more of this coming. The 2027 Pontiac Bonneville isn't asking anyone's forgiveness, it's simply proving it never should have needed to.